Thank you, Mayor Norris, for being here. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So here we are 50 years and 8 months tomorrow from the day on which President Dwight Eisenhower, on his way out of office, warned, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." I don't think we're here to propose Eisenhower or anyone else as a perfect model of all virtues, but what he said that day, 50 years ago, in a very flawed and imperfect speech, was one of the most prescient predictions and potentially valuable warnings ever offered on the face of the earth. I say potentially because we have yet to heed it. Yesterday, the Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of Virginia, Meredith Wu, posted on her blog that our new war in Libya was admirable and, this is a big one in Charlottesville, Jeffersonian. In fact, she compared it to Jefferson's war in the same location, which she held up as, quote, a pristine example of a just war. In her descriptions of that long ago war and the current one, she devoted not one word to the killing, maiming, or traumatizing of innocent people. She made no case for the necessity of either war, except to claim that the first one was fought in self-defense, several thousand miles away, against a band of pirates who had never approached U.S. shores and whom Wu scornfully mocked as unworthy adversaries. Wu's entire case that our Libyan wars have not yet been as bad as our Afghanistan and Iraq wars. Well, aren't those high standards? Aren't I a proud UVA alumnus today? And wouldn't it have been nice to see a little bit of opposition to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars these past 10 years prior to this cheerful comparison of the Libya war as not as bad as the other ones, which, by the way, are still raging. This past Sunday, the Charlottesville Daily Progress printed a column called, quote, "A stimulus package conservatives could support." But there was nothing conservative and nothing Eisenhower would have stood for in the column. I tried to find some points in this column that I could say the author got right, but the best I could come up with was this, and giving her the benefit of the doubt, I suspect that the author, Amity Shales, spelled her own name correctly. Her idea for improving our economy was to increase military spending, including, in particular, through the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. DARPA, you may be aware, is the same agency that has moved on from mechanical killer elephants and telepathic warfare to exploding frisbees, cyber wasps, and Captain America, no meals, no sleep soldiers, as well as far more useful things that could have been developed outside of the military, like the internet and the GPS. But DARPA has 240 employees. Let's double it. Heck, let's triple it. We've still got statistically the exact same unemployment rate we started with. Or let's add 500,000 employees to the military, as Schley's proposes. If we could afford to do that, we could afford to add many more employees elsewhere, because the military is the least efficient way to create jobs. In fact, we could scale back military spending to a level still higher than it was 10 years ago when we all went crazy. Put that money into non-military industries and tax cuts and see a net gain of 30 million jobs, even after finding new jobs for everybody who lost one in the conversion process. We could have full employment and it would not cost us a dime. That fact only seems startling if we lose touch with how much we are spending on the military and what a waste it is. But Schley's has other arguments. First of all, the military knows how to manage youth, she says. Does it? The leading cause of death right now in the U.S. military is suicide. I understand that once you're dead, you are no longer unemployed, but surely that cannot be what Schley's had in mind as a solution to youth unemployment. We tried to bring to this conference a young widow of a soldier whose pleas for help after 7 tours in our current wars went unanswered by our military. He took his life, and his wife publicly described the lengthy process that had led to that tragedy. She was then so viciously harassed that she canceled her conference participation and went into hiding. I suppose that is one way to manage young people. Secondly, Schley's argues, the military is already on all of the campuses. Well, that's certainly true in Charlottesville. Recruiting offices are already open everywhere, she explains. True enough. The military can spend tons of money really fast, she assures us. Well, that's as true as anything could be. But it does not change the fact that you could have many more jobs just as quickly by other means. Feeding the military-industrial complex because it's large and hungry is how Congress members think. It's not how we have to think. Oh, but it's not large, says Schley. It's only 5% of the gross domestic product, less than President Reagan managed, and less than during Vietnam, Korea, or World War II. But think for a minute about this argument. If the country becomes wealthier, and I know it doesn't seem wealthier, but 400 billionaires have as much money as half the country. It is wealthier, it's just concentrated. As I was saying, if the country becomes wealthier, it should spend more money on the military at a steady percentage of GDP. Not because it needs to, but because it can. And because even though almost anything else would produce more jobs, the military will produce some jobs. Schley's statistics are debatable anyway. Chris Hellman recently compiled all the U.S. national security spending through various departments, including the so-called intelligence agencies, Homeland Security, etc., and arrived at $1.2 trillion per year. According to the National Priorities Project, we are dumping 59% of discretionary spending into the military each year. According to the St. Petersburg Times this week, U.S. troops are in 148 countries. We could cut 80% of this madness and still be the world's top military spender. In the process, we could avoid all the damage we are going to hear about during this conference, not only to our economy, but also in terms of weapons proliferation, foreign relations, civil liberties, the natural environment, the rule of law, and lest we forget, the killing of large numbers of human beings. Schley asserts, without argument, that an ever larger military deters wars. Eisenhower warned, and the evidence is extensive, that a larger military creates wars. And that larger military is all over Charlottesville and Virginia. The Daily Progress, which does do a far better job than average of covering peace advocacy, nonetheless willingly prints propaganda for the military-industrial complex, while also carrying a lot of advertisements for the military-industrial complex. And those advertisements are purchased with our tax dollars, funneled through Congress, into the Pentagon, and on over to the so-called private corporations, taking no-bid, uncompeted contracts to enjoy what for some are booming economic times. BAE Systems, which often runs a green full-page ad in the Daily Progress, paid a $400 million fine last year to the U.S. government to settle charges of having bribed Saudi Arabia to buy its weapons. The U.S. government, however, continues dumping billions into BAE. I was speaking with Ray McGovern earlier this evening, who's going to be one of our speakers later this weekend, and he reminded me of something when I brought up the National Ground Intelligence Center, which is now north of town, but used to be downtown in what became the SNL Financial Building. The National Ground Intelligence Center played a key role in the lead up to the war in Iraq, when the experts in Washington would not go along with the conclusions that needed to be reached. When the experts in the Department of Energy said, those aluminum tubes are not for nuclear weapons, they're for rockets, well, that wasn't the answer they were looking for. So who did they call up? The National Ground Intelligence Center, where a couple of characters by the name of George Norris and Robert Campus, who got performance awards, cash payments for this, agreed to say that those aluminum tubes looked like they were for nuclear weapons. Colin Powell put this in his speech at the United Nations despite the warning of his own staff in the State Department that it was not true. This is what scared this country into war. Set aside all the other weapons weapons that are lumped in as weapons of mass destruction. It was the nuclear weapons that scared half this country. And it was the aluminum tubes that were the evidence of the nuclear weapons, along with a couple of other fuzzy claims. And it was these people in Charlottesville who were willing to tell that lie. And it was these people who had a deputy director by the name of Bill Rich Jr., who, together with Bill Rich III, got jobs at a contractor that they hired to help tell these lies, a contractor named MZM. And then, when MZM folded after endless scandals of having bribed Duke Cunningham, MZM being also, by the way, the #1 funder of Congressman Virgil Goode, Bill Rich went on and got another job at a company called Sparta, which does similar work. And both of these companies are at the UVA Research Park across the street from the National Ground Intelligence Center. Right? This is a level of corruption we have reached in every town across this country. The new location of the National Ground Intelligence Center also has units of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency. There's a Judge Advocate General's Legal Center attached to UVA Law School. There's a Virginia National Guard, which does do national guarding, just not of this nation. There are local want ads offering jobs, quote, researching biological and chemical weapons at Battelle Memorial Institute, also located in the UVA Research Park. As you may know, researching such weapons almost always involves producing or at least possessing such weapons. Other jobs are available producing all kinds of weaponry for all kinds of governments at Northrop Grumman. Then there's Tech Systems, Pragmatics, Weiser, and many others with fat Pentagon contracts. Employers recruit here as well for Northern Virginia jobs with Concurrent Technologies Corporation, OG Systems, the Defense Logistics Agency, and on and on and on. From 2000 to 2010, there were 161 military contractors in Charlottesville, pulling in $919 million through 2,737 contracts. Over $8 million of that went to Mr. Jefferson's University, of which 3/4 to the Darden Business School. And the trend is upward each and every year. These 161 contractors are found in various industries, from higher education to nautical system and instrument manufacturing, blind and shade manufacturing, printed circuit assembly, real estate appraisers, engineering services, recreational sports centers, research and development in biotechnology, new car dealers, internet publishing, petroleum merchant wholesalers, and a 2006 contract with Pig Daddy's Barbecue. Piedmont Virginia Community College, which has been gracious enough to allow our conference to rent its facilities tomorrow and Sunday, has a new program aimed at qualifying more students for military so-called intelligence work. And Charlottesville is relatively military-free as areas of Virginia go. Were the state of Virginia to ban participation in wars of aggression, weapons sales to brutal dictatorships, and the manufacture of aggressive and illegal weapons, the military-industrial complex would be obliged to help itself to many billions of public dollars just to cover the cost of moving operations to the other 49 states or abroad. I think Shepard Johnson may be here tonight. If you give this friend of mine a ride around Virginia, he will point out current and former public and secret military facilities behind just about every hill. With his help, I've compiled a list of highlights. The Pentagon and all of its surrounding weapons corporations' headquarters are in Virginia. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff lives at Quarters 6 at Fort Myer in Arlington. The Army and Air Force Chiefs of Staff on General's Row in Fort Myer. Norfolk, the world's largest Navy base, and NATO is there, and until last month, the United States Joint Forces Command. The Army has major commands, including the United States Army Combined Arms Support Command at Fort Lee and the United States Army Training and Doctrine Command at Fort Eustis. The Air Force has its Air Combat Command at Langley Air Force Base. Langley and Eustis form the Joint Base Langley-Eustis. The Port of Hampton Roads is a seaport of embarkation. Also in Tidewater is Lambert's Point at Norfolk. 2 large shipyards found in Newport News with Northrop Grumman and Portsmouth, there to service the world's largest naval base. The military is down in Radford with a major munitions plant, up in Warrenton with 4 military sites, at least one of them used by the CIA. The Navy has SEALs teams at Little Creek and Team 6 at Dam Neck. Military forces operating at the secret command of the President. In Peters Mountain near Gordonsville, an AT&T site that many believe the military used to use and probably still does, the Defense Intelligence Agency used to train psychic spies, that's right, men who would stare at goats if they could recognize one, at a place in Nelson County called the Monroe Institute. The Army prepares for war in Virginia at Fort Belvoir, Fort Eustis, Fort Lee, Fort Monroe, Fort Myer, Fort Story. The Navy at the Navy Amphibious Base at Little Creek, the Naval Surface Warfare Center, Dahlgren, Naval Station Norfolk, Norfolk Naval Shipyard, Oceana Naval Air Station, the cause of all that noise pollution at Virginia Beach, and the Naval Weapons Station Yorktown. Meanwhile, the Marines are at Quantico with the FBI Academy. The NSA is in Chesapeake, just across the West Virginia line as well. The CIA is at Camp Peary, also known as the Farm, next door to Colonial Williamsburg, where CIA warriors and foreign warriors are trained. The intelligence community may not have much intelligence or community, but it has a lot of Virginia real estate, including the Office of the Director of National Intelligence at Tyson's Corner, right next to the National Counterterrorism Intelligence Center, not far from the headquarters of the CIA, which also has offices in Reston and Herndon. Then there's the National Reconnaissance Office in Chantilly, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency in Springfield, the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command, National Ground Intelligence Center here in Charlottesville. The command is headquartered at Fort Belvoir. The DIA is at Bolling Air Force Base in D.C., but has an office building in Clarendon. The Marine Corps, their so-called intelligence activity, as well as their prison for whistleblowers from Smedley Butler down to Bradley Manning, is at Quantico. The Office of Naval Intelligence in Suitland, Maryland, has a training center at Dam Neck and known as the Navy Marine Maritime Intelligence Center. Langley Air Force Base is the 480th Intelligence Surveillance and Reconnaissance Wing. The Virginia National Guard, emphasis on national, is located all over Virginia, including just down Avon Street. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency is in Herndon, and here. Mount Weather in Northern Virginia is set up to host our federal government underground in times of emergency, as was its predecessor across the West Virginia line at Greenbrier, which now offers tours of Congress's potential second home underground, or lets you rent the space out for parties with, quote, a James Bond MASH or spy theme. The private military corporations in Virginia are larger than what I have said of the public military operations in Virginia. Down in Lynchburg, Areva manufactures fuel rods for nuclear reactors. Virginia is home to SAIC, DynCorp, Mantech, MPRI, CACI-Z, or Blackwater, which is moving to Arlington from its location just across the North Carolina line, a location at which the Virginia Beach Police train and from which many Blackwater employees commute to live in Virginia Beach. L3 Flight International Aviation is in Newport News. A company called American Type Culture Collection in Manassas supplied the biological materials for anthrax to Saddam Hussein. And then think about this for a minute. After it was clear that Iraq had no more anthrax, which had been supplied by Virginia, the pretense that it did still have it was somehow part of a justification to bomb a nation full of human beings, 99.999% of whom had never shaken hands with Donald Rumsfeld. Then there's Virginia's congressional delegation, which splits its time between Virginia and D.C. Eisenhower was talked out of saying military-industrial congressional complex, but the meaning came through. The 5th District has flip-flopped between 2 big political parties in the last 2 elections without the slightest impact on its representation in terms of war and military spending. In the midst of this hysterical debate over debt and deficits in Washington this summer, the House passed a bigger military spending bill than ever. I mean, on the face of this planet, with almost no comment. And the Senate Appropriations Committee took it up yesterday. They're going to pass the same thing. I have yet to hear of the first Tea Party protest. We are drawn almost irresistibly to imagining that whatever harm all this endless military activity does to the world and to our future safety, at the very least it means jobs. It brings money into Virginia from Washington. And in fact, unlike many states, Virginia does get back more federal money than it puts in. But it puts in a heck of a lot. And it gets it back in the least economically beneficial manner possible. At costofwar.com, you can find a number ticking ever upwards, showing that the nation has spent thus far on its two largest current wars, both of which a majority of Americans have favored ending for some time now. The figure is now over $1.2 trillion. If you click on Virginia and then on Charlottesville, you get $105 million as the amount in taxes that Charlottesville has paid for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. That doesn't include future costs of interest, veterans care, impact on fuel prices, lost opportunities. Right, you've got to multiply by 4 or 5 to be realistic. But our wars are a small part of the $1.2 trillion we spend each year on the military. We've spent $1.2 trillion on these two wars over a decade, but we spend $1.2 trillion total each and every year on the national security state. So each year, Charlottesville dumps $105 million into the military-industrial complex. Sure, it gets some of it back, but the city of Charlottesville has a budget of about $130 million. I'm willing to bet the mayor could think of some useful things that could be done with an extra $105 million, or even a little bit of it. Federal funding for block grants and other programs is being cut all the time. Do not let anybody tell you that military spending is not a local issue. It would be hard to do worse, morally or economically, than handing that money over and passing it through the war machine. Nations with less wealth than ours have higher standards of living, life expectancies, infant survival rates, education levels, vacation days, retirement security, progress toward green energy. There is no technological reason we cannot run everything in this country on clean energy. There's no law of physics preventing us from providing free, top-quality education for all who want it from preschool through college. There's no medical reason we can't have universal health coverage. What is standing in the way, and I'll end on this point, is a broken political system. And what is breaking it is in large part the military-industrial complex. We are going to be discussing alternatives on Sunday. We're going to be discussing plans and actions that are upcoming, including plans to resist this in Washington, D.C. in October, to which I refer you to October2011.org.